Hi everyone, we haven't seen each other for a while now, so I thought that it was about time that we came and read together. So I'm going to continue with Goodnight Mr. Tom, as we've been reading that in class. So here we go. William Shaky, said Willie quietly to himself. Shakespeare, hooted Carrie. William Shakespeare, he repeated. William. So he had the first name of somebody famous. The next article that Zack dragged out was a stiff black circular object. He shook it, and in 1 second it became a shiny top hat. He placed it on his thick, wiry hair and cocked it slightly to one side. Everyone was terribly impressed. He then pulled out a small black suit. The jacket of the suit curved in at the waist, and at the back were 2 buttons above a pair of tails. There was a stiff white object called a dicky. It was a collar and bow tie, and the front of a shirt. Dangling from it were 2 thin cords to be tied at the back. Zack put it on, and when the jacket was done up, it looked as if he was wearing a proper dress shirt. Imitation white cuffs were attached to the end of the jacket sleeves. Proper job, remarked George. Ginny examined the whole suit very closely. She turned back the sleeves to see exactly how the cuffs had been sewn in. Zack unwrapped a pair of objects wrapped in newspaper. My taps! He held up a pair of shiny black patent shoes. On each sole were 2 pieces of metal, one at the tip and one at the end. What kind of shoes is they? Asked George, puzzled. Tap shoes. You've seen Fred Astaire dance, haven't you? Well, it's... He stopped. The others were all shaking their heads from side to side. I've heard of Fred Barnes, said George. He owns the big farm up at... Will, you're a Londoner. You must have seen him at the pictures. I ain't allowed, emphasised Willie. I don't do that sort of thing. Zack was astounded. He thought the whole world had heard of Fred Astaire. Well, there's only one way to explain tap. He moved the case to one side, rolled back the carpet and told the others to sit by the bookcase. He then put the shoes on and laced them up. He did not look strange in the elegant black shoes, darned woolen socks. He did look strange in the elegant black shoes, darned woolen socks, threadbare shorts, top hat, and tails. Now this is what is called a tap spring, and he lightly tapped his right foot along the floorboards and hopped neatly onto it, leaving his left leg raised slightly behind him. Carrie smothered a giggle. He glared at her. If you don't want to see what it's like, then I shan't bother wasting my time. Ginny gave her sister a dig in the ribs. Come on, said George. Take no notice of her. If it hadn't been for Willie's attentive expression, he would have stopped. All right, he said. Here goes. And a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And with that, he danced around the room, his shoes tapping rhythmically on the floor, springing and twirling around, and as he tapped and stamped, he yelled out, Shuffle, hop, cramp, roll, buffalo! He concluded the dance with a double spin, springing sideways in the air and kicking his feet sharply together, and as he did so, he landed in a heap on the bed. George, the twins, and Willie broke out into applause. Zack collapsed on the bed and grinned sheepishly at them. They were interrupted by the entrance of Mrs. Little. She stood and glared at them, brandishing a hefty piece of ceiling plaster in her hand. Zack, she said, looking directly at him, I presume you are responsible for this. He looked up at her from the bed, his cheeks flushed with the exertions of his performance, the taps of his shoes exposed to her scrutiny. Sorry, Aunt Nance, he began earnestly. I know it's difficult, interrupted Mrs. Little, but we don't want to treat real casualties just yet, so keep the noise down, will you? Zack nodded and opened the door, and she opened the door out onto the landing and it closed behind her. They sat silently and listened to her footsteps fading away down the staircase. Zack undid his shoes. Never mind, said Ginny quietly. You can show us again another time. Not if this wretched drizzle continues and we have to stay indoors, he said. It's awful having to creep around all the time. You was fine, broke in Willie. You was real fine. Zack beamed. Come on, slow coach, urged George. Zack hurriedly unpacked a soft, flat parcel. With a flourish, he pulled out a jersey of many colours. The body and sleeves were knitted in coloured squares, red, yellow, green, black and orange. He struggled out of his old jersey and put it on. He even had to turn up the sleeves. Wonderful, isn't it? He remarked. But the others could only stare at him in speechless amazement. "You ain't going to wear that, is you?" said George. "Why ever not?" "Well, 'tis a bit bright, ain't it? You'll have Charlie Ruddles after you with blackout curtains," said Carrie. Ginny giggled. Zack turned to Willie. The jersey had a polo neck collar in red. The cuffs and the waistband were ribbed in the same colour. Willie thought that next to Zack's deep complexion and black hair, the red looked quite pleasing. "I think it's fine," he said quietly, and Zack knew he was speaking truthfully. There were socks in the case, a scarf, cape, and coloured tights, scraps of material, and a pair of old black ankle boots with a label hanging on to them. It read, "Found these in theatre wardrobe. No use to them. Too small. Have had them resold. Hope they fit you. If too big, you can always stuff the toes. Love, Mummy." He closed the case and passed around the cakes. "Where shall we meet tomorrow night?" he asked. "What's wrong with here?" said Carrie. Zack pointed his thumb downwards. "There's always something going on here in the evenings. If it's not first aid, it's knitting socks for Icelandic Seamen Club." "Well, there ain't much to do in our place," said George. "I share with David, and he's bound to keep coming in to see what we's doing, and Edward hasn't a room of his own, ever. Now that Mike's gone, he guards it like we're a blimmin' gold mine." Zack turned to the twins. "How about your place?" The twins looked at each other. "We've a room between us," said Jenny, "but there's Sophie." Sophie was their 8-year-old sister. "She'd be nosing in on us," said Carrie. Willie remained silent. He had a room. It was terribly private and precious, though. Dare he risk inviting them and asking Mr. Tom's permission? After all, he was still wetting his bed. He would hate the others to find out. "Zack," he began huskily. He cleared his throat. "There's my room." "Of course!" he cried. "I'd forgotten. Could we meet at your place?" "I'll ask Mr. Tom," he said, flushing slightly. "Well, that's settled," said Zack with finality. Willie was not so sure. "What's the next game to be?" "Not Tarzan again." "I've had enough of being an ape," said George. "Actually," said Zack, "I've got another idea brewing. How about Sherlock Holmes? You could be Moriarty, George." "The arch enemy?" "Yes," said Zack, surprised. "How did you know?" George raised his eyes. He was always the arch enemy, and Carrie was invariably his evil assistant. "Does that mean I has to die or be rescued again?" said Ginny. "Well, not exactly," said Zack, a little perturbed. "Anyway, as I was saying, Will, you could be—" "Dr. Watson," chorused George and the twins. Willie was always Zack's faithful assistant, and it was quite obvious as soon as Sherlock Holmes was mentioned that Zack would be the famous deer-stalker detective. "How about sitting in a tree waiting for badgers?" suggested George, "or seeing if Spooky Cot is really haunted." Spooky Cot was the name given to a deserted cottage. It was surrounded by an undergrowth of tangled bushes and trees. Over the years, several people had reported hearing strange sounds emanating from it. George and the twins dared not venture near it except in the broadest of daylight, and even then they usually fled at first sight of it. "At night?" asked Ginny, and she shivered. "Yes, with a torch." "Blackout regulations." "Drat," said George. "What about a show?" suggested Zack. "We've got the school nativity play," said George, "and Miss Thorne is already producing something for the Women's Guild." They sat in silence, racking their brains for an idea. Suddenly Zack yelled, "I say, we could have a newspaper, a sort of gazette." "Yes," said Willie, who really liked the idea, but the others thought he was only supporting Zack because he was his special friend. Carrie glanced at Ginny and George looked at Carrie and back to Zack. "Come to think of it, it ain't a bad idea. I could do the animal bits." "And I could do the news from abroad and about the war," said Carrie. "Some war," groaned George. "It don't seem like it's even begun." "And I could do a cookery and household tips column," piped in Ginny. "What'll you do, Zack?" "I'll think of something, even if I have to put on a show myself." "Village news," she cried. "Extraordinary events in Little Weirwold." "Willie can do the illustrations, and I think you'd better be editor, Carrie," suggested Zack. "Me? Why me?" "'Cause you're the brainy one," said George. "Let's vote for it then," said Zack, and immediately everyone raised their arms. Goodness, gasped Ginny, catching sight of the clock. We'll have to go. We'll be in trouble if we don't run for it. She, Carrie, and George grabbed their coats and fled out of the room and down the stairs. When shall we meet? Whispered Zack urgently after them. Can't tomorrow, said Carrie. We's babysitting, said Ginny. Sophie's sitting, they added in unison. How about Thursday then? Choir practice, said George. Friday? Friday was agreed. They hurriedly whispered their goodbyes to each other, and after the front door had been closed, Willie followed Zack into his bedroom. Now, said Zack, jumping onto the bed, I can read my letter. And he pulled out the crumpled envelope from his shorts. You don't mind, do you? He said, glancing at Willie, who had sat down beside him. No, answered Willie. Of course not. He wriggled back further onto the bed till he was leaning up against the wall. He could hardly believe that Zack was his special friend. Zack said he was a good listener and that he was a sensitive being. Willie thought being sensitive was being a sissy. Zack didn't think so. He admired him for it. Admired him. He glanced over at Zack. He was lying sprawled across a pillow, leaning on his elbow, his head propped to one side, reading the letter. There seemed to be pages. His own mother had written to little Weirwold only once since his arrival 8 weeks ago, and the letter had been addressed to Mr. Tom. He had read it out to him, but he knew that he'd missed bits out. He had actually written a letter of his own to her, his first ever. He'd even addressed the envelope, bought the stamp by himself, and posted it. I expect she's been too busy to answer, he thought, what with the war and everything. For a brief moment he thought of his home in London, and brushed the memory aside. There was a knock on the front door downstairs, and the sound of Mrs. Little opening it. That's Mr. Tom, said Willie, moving off the bed. Mrs. Little called up to him. I got to go. Bother, said Zack. They were at the top of the stairs when Zack touched his shoulder. Don't forget about the room, will you? He whispered. Willie shook his head and ran down the stairs. Tom was waiting for him at the bottom. Willie put his gabardine and cap on and slung his gas mask box across over his shoulder. The sky was almost black when he and Tom stepped aside. A strong wind tore through the streets, whipping the branches fiercely to one side while the rain swept across their faces. Tom put up the umbrella. Best hang tight to me arm, boy, he yelled, and together they leaned forward and tramped through the long, wet grass to wrestle with the Little's gate. Willie clung firmly to him. He pulled his cap down over his eyes, but the wind whistled bitterly through his ears. They passed the Bush family's cottage and struggled by the vicarage. The leaves flew and scattered around in fragments, brushing their bodies and sticking to their wet cheeks. They fought with the long gate into the Dobbs field, and Tom checked that she was sheltered. The wind tried to wrench the umbrella from his hands. He hung grimly on and wrestled with it until he could lower it in front of them. Half running, half walking, they fled through the back garden, narrowly missing the Anderson, and threw themselves into the passageway, the leaves swirling in after them. They slammed the door behind and then panted and smiled in the darkness. It was as if someone had turned off the sound. Tom opened the sitting room door and the silence was broken by Sammy as he came bounding up, leaping up at the pair of them, barking excitedly. Willie hung his gabardine and cap on his peg while Sammy stood on his hind legs and placed his paws on his stomach. Willie ruffled his fur. Has it been fed? He asked. No, lad, I left it for you. Willie grinned happily. It was one of his jobs to feed Sammy in the evenings. After he had fed, he wiped his boots dry with an old rag, put the kettle on and sat down at the table with pencil and paper. "'Tis late for that," said Tom. "Just 10 minutes," pleaded Willie. "Mrs. Black says if I can do me letters and me capitals better, I can start joined up writing soon." "No longer, though." "Ta." And with that he began writing. Tom made the tea and took down 2 large white mugs from hooks hanging by the window. One had the letter T on it, the other a letter W. Since Willie was so desperate to be accepted into Mrs. Hartridge's class, Tom had been helping in every possible way. He had stuck labels in various places so that Willie would associate an object with a word, until after a time Willie labelled them himself. He glanced at all the bits of paper hanging higgledy-piggledy on the furniture and walls. He hoped that Willie would manage to get into Mrs. Hartridge's class before she left. It had been announced only a month ago that she was expecting her first child, and probably be leaving after the spring term. He glanced at Willie, who had now finished writing. He was sitting quietly drinking his tea. It wasn't until after he had gone to bed that Willie asked about the room. He had remained subdued for the rest of the evening, glancing at Tom and looking away. It was Tom who finally eked it out of him. He'd gone up to his room. He'd gone up as usual to turn Willie's lamp down, and he had found him sitting up in bed with one of his library books lying open on his knees. Instead of tracing the pages with his finger as he usually did, he was staring vacantly into space. He came over to him, closed the book, and put it on the table. "Now then," he said, crouching under the eave and seating himself comfortably at the foot of his bed. "What's it all about, eh?" Willie looked at him, startled. "What's eating you? You've been in a brown cloud ever since supper." Willie took a deep breath. "You see," he began, "Edward won't let George in his room because of the war, and Zack says they're knitting boots in the sitting room, and the twins says they might only—" "Slow down," said Tom, "and get to the point." "Mr. Tom," he said breathlessly, "could I have Jack and George and Zack and Carrie and Ginny up here in this room?" "Don't see why not. They've been thrown out of their homes." "No, it's just there ain't much room at George's, and Zack says—" "No need to explain. This is your room. You does what you like. Only," he warned, pointing his pipe in Willie's direction, "if there's any mess, you has to clean it up. Understand?" "Yeah, course," said Willie. "When is they wanting to come?" "Friday." "Friday 'tis then." He stood up and kissed his forehead. "Night, lad," he said quietly. "Mr. Tom," said Willie, as he turned the lamp down. "Yes?" "They don't know about, and he patted the blanket with his hands. "The bedwetting? You ain't ashamed of that, is you?" Willie nodded. "And no need to mention it. I'll make your bed up before the evening so's they won't see the rubber. That do?" "Yeah, ta." The room was blackened in darkness until Tom removed the blackout curtains. "Night," he said again, and he disappeared down the steps, closing the trapdoor after him. Willie leaned his head back on his upraised hands. He glanced at the slanting window pane. The rain was running down the glass in tiny, sparkling rivulets. He snuggled down into the warm blankets. He never thought he would ever come to love the rain, but he did now. The last thing he remembered before falling asleep was the patter, patter, patter of it gently and rhythmically hitting the tiled roof above his head. And that's the end of that chapter. So we will read chapter 11 tomorrow. Goodbye, Bella.